Get ready, fans of Jerry Goldsmith and backers of conductor Lee Phillips' most recent soundtrack re-recording triumph. We will soon have our physical copies of the original television scores to Pursuit, The People Next Door, and Crawlspace, all on a single disc from the wonderful Entrada Records. But before that happens, welcome to a very special sneak peek into this amazing and most anticipated soundtrack re-recording. I'm Ted, the soundtrack guy. Stick with me until the end of this video. There's another amazing soundtrack re-recording by the great Lee Phillips in his Jerry Goldsmith anthology project that you won't want to miss. Stay tuned and we'll be discussing that in great detail. Now, even among hardcore Jerry Goldsmith film music fans, the worthy television scores that we will be discussing today are extraordinarily rare, and not many are familiar with this music, and we couldn't be outside of the context of the films themselves. This music has never been released in any format due to the absence of master tapes. But speaking of the Jerry Goldsmith anthology project, this is the fourth installment in Lee Phillips' amazing project to preserve Goldsmith's legacy. And once again, Lee Phillips has done an exemplary job here in this premiere release for this amazing television music. As with Lee's previous Goldsmith re-recording, Jerry Goldsmith at the General Electric Theater, this triple title soundtrack re-recording for these television scores was performed by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra, this time conducted by one of Europe's most experienced film music conductors, Adam Clemens. I've had the express privilege of hearing this music in advance of its physical release, and I have listened to it probably about 25 times or more all the way through. This re-recording sounds fantastic. The performances are top-notch, and every Jerry Goldsmith fan and film music fan and just fan of symphonic music in general is going to be over the moon for this album. So let's talk about the physical album that we are all greatly anticipating for a moment, shall we? This is an Entrada Excalibur Collection album running at 67.5 minutes with a total of 46 tracks, presenting the complete re-recorded scores to Pursuit, The People Next Door, and Crawlspace. We are getting a beautiful package here. This is just an absolutely lovely, generous booklet. We've got plenty of cool photos from these three television movies. It's an outstanding layout. I am really looking forward to getting this in physical format. I mean, the dopamine hit every time. You know what I'm talking about, soundtrack collectors. The dopamine hit you get when you open up your mailbox and you've got a box of soundtracks there waiting for you. This one is going to be something intense when I open up my box from Entrada Records and I'm able to actually hold this gem in my hands. Inside the booklet, we have knockout liner notes by renowned film music journalist and author John Burlingame, who gives a thorough overview of these three incredible scores. And also, we have more liner notes from Goldsmith scholar Yavar Maradi. He returns with superbly detailed cue notes for a welcome track-by-track analysis of each of these scores. I've poured through and studied these liner notes from top to bottom multiple times and found them to be almost endlessly fascinating, and I have no doubt that you're going to feel the same way. Don't miss out on more from Yavar, as well as an all-star lineup of co-hosts at the terrific podcast, The Goldsmith Odyssey, which is a chronological journey through the filmography of composer Jerry Goldsmith. So let's start our deep dive into these three television soundtracks, shall we? I didn't really know what to to expect when I got involved in watching these three movies. I had no familiarity with any of them prior to this project, and I thought, well, I'm gonna do it for Goldsmith. I'll watch these movies for Goldsmith, and you Goldsmith fans out there, you know what I'm talking about. You'll watch movies no matter how bad they are, as long as Jerry Goldsmith did the film music, because his music makes it all worth it, as painful as the rest of the experience occasionally is. But in this case, I was pleasantly surprised with all three of these projects. The first soundtrack on this wonderful collection is this soundtrack for the 1972 film Pursuit. This one is based on Michael Crichton's novel called Binary, which he wrote under a pen name, and this is also Crichton's directorial debut. Pursuit is a 1972 made-for-TV thriller about a political extremist plotting to destroy San Diego. In all honesty, this 90-minute tense cat-and-mouse tale plays with notable intensity, all on its own merits, but with Goldsmith's score, becomes one of the better made-for-TV thrillers around. Indeed, there's no music at all for the first 12 minutes of the film, and in the case of Pursuit, I was a bit surprised when I heard Jerry Goldsmith's music enter the scene about 12 minutes in, because it has this hip and groovy contemporary band sound, and my first reaction was, well, I thought that I was watching a thriller, and all of a sudden, you know, we've got this hipness going on, we've got this band sound going on. But it only took me a couple of seconds to realize, wow, this is another stroke of Goldsmith genius, because somehow, in that contemporary band sound, he's got all the intensity of this political thriller wrapped up in every note that he's displaying on this soundtrack. It really is fascinating and fun and thrilling all at the same time. From the very first frame, this movie moves with terrific speed, and Crichton employs the optical effect of a digital clock ticking at the bottom of the screen in a lot of places, and Goldsmith takes cues from this device with a clock-like motif of his own, and it reminds me a lot of what composer Christopher Young likes to do for his soundtracks often, and that is to have this time-keeping effect going on, this ticking clock, you're running out of time sense. This is a cool and exciting 25.5-minute soundtrack, and it looks forward to the type of music that he'd write for the pilot to Police Story. Now, of course, the question on everybody's mind is, Ted, do you have any favorite tracks from Pursuit? Well, hold on to your seats, we're about to get into that one. The first track that I'd love to gush on is the track titled Meet Mr. Right. This is the track that enters with a lot of impact because of the previous 12-minute restraint that we were talking about a moment ago. Now, while Stephen Graves and his associate tail their surveillance subject, the political extremist James Wright, Goldsmith is in here with his primary musical ideas for the score being introduced and building tension and energy in that noted groovy style, heightening mystery and intrigue every step of the way. Another notable track, Get Me a Lawyer. In this track, we have the most formed ticking clock effect as the pace picks up a notch. Now, liner notes writer Yavar Maradi aptly notes the queasy sound to this effect in the brass, which looks forward to the swooning, nauseating music present in a later, very intense scene in this movie when Graves risks his life to disarm Wright's nerve gas device. And this dizzy, nauseating kind of music in brass kind of reminds me a lot of what Michael Giacchino ended up doing for his wonderful music for the soundtrack to the television series Lost. Leading into the next track I want to talk about, it's often occurred to me just how many times, were I to go through Jerry Goldsmith's filmography track by track, I'd come across track titles titled Breakout. As a matter of fact, as we all know, he scored a movie called Breakout as well, and here in the soundtrack to Pursuit, we have another track titled Breakout. note. This is a highlight track for sure. This is the score's first full action cue. This is when Wright briefly escapes his interrogation, only to die in a car crash soon after. This is a super exciting barrage of percussion here in this track as the main theme develops during blaring, exciting brass and up-tempo rhythms and a thrilling bass guitar ostinato repeated fast over and over and then ending in 4 brass blasts when the crash happens. Now sprinting right along into the next of my favorite tracks on this particular soundtrack. It is the track titled Get the Sniffer. This is where Graves' colleague sprints downstairs to get an explosive detection device, and Goldsmith gives us another propulsive action cue. We've got speedy rhythms here, and the tension is building to this bursting point with synth and brass figures, and finally finishing with the main theme bursting forth on brass. And the main theme has been present throughout the score, and it shows up in various guises and, greater or lesser intensity depending on the dramatic needs of the film. But in this case, it is just glorious and groovy, and the brass just bursts forth, and it's this bum, ba, ba, bum, ba, 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 bum, ba, 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 bum. This track is just tense and smooth and too cool for school, just like the rest of this album. Overall, this score for Pursuit is consistently tense and propulsive. It is absolutely a thrilling whirlwind of a ride. The next soundtrack on this album is for The People Next Door. This is actually the earliest TV movie of this collection. It aired in 1968 as the opening installment of the second season of CBS Playhouse. Now, this one is a drama about a family dealing with the daughter's use of LSD, but believe me, this is actually quite a bit deeper than that, has all kinds of levels, and is super well done. We've got incredible performances here, especially from Deborah Winters, the wild child daughter. And of course, as we all know, Goldsmith excels at writing brilliant music for character-centric dramas, for the psychology, for the things that you don't see, but that you know is underneath the surface. And he does a fantastic job here. This score is actually a pretty brief soundtrack. It's about 15 and a half minutes long, and in turns, it's both sensitive, melancholy, and melodic, as well as brash or sometimes subtle in this avant-garde style that can be quite frightening at times. Now, as far as my favorite tracks go, one of them, of course, would have to be Main Title. This is very reminiscent of the Chinatown theme. Here again, featured on the melancholy solo trumpet over keyboards and strings. And keen-eared listeners will also note that while it sounds like Chinatown perhaps in its instrumentation, melodically it sounds a lot like The World Only Lovers See from Jerry Goldsmith's fabulous soundtrack for The Chairman. And this music conveys the feeling of a highly complex and deeply troubled scenario among the dramatic key players that might not have a solution at all. We're in the middle of a mess gone too far, and little by little, all the characters are going to realize that, especially the parents of the drug-abusing daughter. The track Bad Trip is a striking example of Jerry Goldsmith's use of the avant-garde approach, more of the modernist writing for the drug scenes. There's a couple of them in this movie. And in this case here, we have Maxie Mason, who's having a bad trip, cowering in her closet, and the music is scary and distorted and perfectly captures the teenager's hallucinations. We've got shivering strings and a kind of eerie music box sound going on in the background, and the way that this begins on flute, it's just kind of almost this piping, disjointed sound that propels us into her terrifying world that she's experiencing now due to her overdose. Very, very fantastic and effective. Reminds me of Planet of the Apes, believe it or not, and also his concert work for Christus Apollo. In the track Sleepless Night, we have Maxie's parents, Arthur and Jerry, and they're engaged in this troubled conversation about their kids. And Jerry Goldsmith gets into the fabric of their feelings here with sympathetic development of the main theme. It's very sensitive, delicate on piano and strings, and this haunted flute is here again, along with a muted trumpet, which stitches together the jazz band sound of the track The East Village, which features more muted trumpet, saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. This soundtrack is full of incredible character portraits, very deep and beneath the surface character portraits. Every main player is investigated by Jerry Goldsmith's very insightful music that speaks right to the center of your soul, again, in that unseen realm that communicates stuff that you can't see and that you might not even be able to articulate fully in words. But in music, Jerry Goldsmith has just got these people in the spirit realm, so to speak. And it's just such a powerful way to demonstrate what's really going on in the hearts and minds of all of these people. In this section of music for the track The East Village, it is no different. There's so much depth here. The people next door are just that. They're right next door. And Maxie's parents are beginning to realize that they are right at the very center of the problem themselves too. And of course, they discover later that the Hoffman's son, their neighbor's son Sandy, is Maxie's drug dealer. And as this drama develops, you come to realize that Arthur and Jerry are having their eyes opened to their own hypocrisy and their own dark places within their heart and their soul, and all the things that they've done to contribute to all of the tragedy that's developing around them. And their son, Artie, my favorite character in this movie, he was such a cool, grounded guy. He's perhaps the only clear-headed voice in this entire gaggle of confusion. The track A Father's Rage, this is the only action cue in this particular soundtrack. This is where Sandy's been freed from jail on a technicality and Arthur attacks him. And Goldsmith comes in with timpani, piano, electric guitar, and just builds to these sawing strings. And it's savage, and it's angry, and Arthur hates himself here, I believe, even more than Sandy. And this reminds me a lot of the last 40 seconds of the soundtrack to Magic in the track called Fats Blows the Whistle. And after Goldsmith brings the whole scene to a thrilling and tragic climax, he moves back into the solo trumpet. It's very sad as Arthur is put into the police car and is taken away to the station. Overall, a very poignant and thought-provoking offering. Very glad that this being the stretch goal for this Kickstarter project was actually funded and recorded. You know what they say, right? Save the best for last. Well, in my opinion, of these three film scores, this next and final soundtrack offered on this album is the best, but boy, it's a really tough call because pretty much everything Jerry Goldsmith writes is the best. I think we can all agree on that. But this one really hit me in a particular way that made it very special as far as I'm concerned. And that is the soundtrack to Crawlspace, the 1972 made-for-TV horror thriller movie based on a Herbert Lieberman novel of the same name. This story concerns a childless, middle-aged couple who adopt a troubled youth they find living in their crawlspace and attempt to get him to rejoin society with tragic results. Now, one of the reasons why this is my favorite soundtrack on this album is because it's possibly the most dynamic of the three offerings as far as I'm able to tell, and overall it's just such a strong, securely placed and confident soundtrack in its own world. It's very suspenseful and touching and tragic, just a great 23.5-minute score and finale to this superb collection of soundtracks. The first of my favorite tracks for Crawlspace would have to be Main Title. This is a delicate harp and woodwinds piece of music, and it really sets the stage for the touching and tragic edge that's prevalent in this dramatic narrative, along with a bit of mystery. The music has mystery involved, especially in the opening on the flute and the harp. And then after a few moments, it moves into the use of the harpsichord, believe it or not, which is Goldsmith's instrument of choice for the main theme. And this was interesting. I really got a kick out of his use for this, because as you watch this film, you realize that this middle-aged couple, they love classical music, in particular Vivaldi, it would seem. They're playing music from the Four Seasons a lot while they're having dinner and sitting around their living room. And of course, Vivaldi and composers of the Baroque era were accustomed to using the harpsichord, and so Goldsmith uses that here in this score, and that is the couple's voice. That's their character, that's their heart, that's their childlessness and their yearning for that void to be filled. And also the flute in this score, that is the yearning to be loved aspect to the character Richard, who is the youth that they find living in their crawl space. It's this mournful flute, and the entire tragic drama is present here in this amazing main theme. After this, we have a bit of blossoming hope in the music, a kind of perplexed hope, if you will, in the track Uninvited Guest. And this is as Alice and Albert wonder at their welcoming behavior toward Richard. And this is done on woodwind and strings and this persistent bass line. And within the next few tracks, the track The Box and Open Door, Goldsmith plays on this sweetly optimistic level. And I believe it's so as not to give away too early the darker aspects to the relationship about to be formed here with Richard. Now, after that, the track Investigation introduces the suspense with low-end piano rhythms and uneasy woodwinds as they realize that Richard is in fact staying in their crawl space. And this tension just builds from this point on and builds in the track Locked Out, as well as plenty of other tracks. And the energy of the track Locked Out reminds me a lot of the track Practice from one of my favorite 1990s Jerry Goldsmith soundtracks, which I believe is very, very much underrated, and that is the soundtrack to The Vanishing. Other soundtracks that kept coming to my mind as I was listening to Goldsmith's tense writing in this soundtrack are the soundtracks for High Velocity and Breakout, and all of this tension in the soundtrack for Crawlspace is just culminating and building this entire time and finally erupts in this amazing pulse-pounding track called Bumper to Bumper. But before that, going back to the track Locked Out, we have this wonderfully urgent music pushing toward this crisis point. It's highly layered character material, beautifully constructed, and ending in a stinger. The next track I want to point out is called The Grocery Store. Here we have ominous melodic timpani, more breakout and high velocity rhythms and motifs in here. And here we have a return of the harpsichord, only here it's a very dark sounding track, darkly played on the harpsichord, and it's communicating Richard's cemented and demented attachment to Albert and Alice, his loyalty toward them, his misguided and deranged loyalty toward them. And now that harpsichord, now Albert and Alice is a part of Richard, and thematically it becomes blended now. So it's the three of them, whereas in main titles, as we discussed earlier, they were separated in their own identities and their own yearnings and needs. But now, in this track, The Grocery Store, the way that the harpsichord plays, they're all together in this blender, and boy, things are gonna start getting interesting moving forward. And all of this musically dramatic material builds to the track called The Woods. This is a brief 30-second cue about which Yavar writes, Goldsmith establishes a thrilling ostinato of scurrying strings and woodwinds, the harpsichord stridently returning with an ambiguous variant of the main theme. And you really do in this music get the impression that Richard has sort of a strength that's bursting forth, a confidence that's coming out of his character and out of his troubled psyche. And here, as he's running through the woods, it's just captured so effectively in Jerry Goldsmith's music. As alluded to a moment ago, the track Bumper to Bumper, this is a highlight track, my favorite sustained action cue in this score. It happens during a car chase, and once again, the dark, angry harpsichord is just seething here. It's kind of like the track The Mafia Marines from High Velocity. There's kind of a texture and a temperature in that track that's a lot like the harpsichord work in this track Bumper to Bumper. And then Goldsmith introduces this rhythmic timpani and low-end piano, these bursts. They're kind of like arms fire. And that reminds me a lot of the work that Goldsmith did in the track Breakout Part 2, Here They Come, from the soundtrack Breakout. It's this and it's just, this timpani is so powerful. Only in the Breakout score, it's done on strings, but it's the same kind of melodic setup there. And although this music is primarily painting a picture for the physical action that we're seeing, I still maintain that it remains a character portrait of Richard. And in this case, it's communicating his fear and anger and confusion and his inability to ever find a safe place, as he would put it. This intense and dark action writing continues in the track The Captives, and this track is similar to the racing tone of the track The Woods, but in this case, it trades the unhinged and strengthened edge that was found in the track The Woods for fearfulness and a loss of control. Finally, the last track I'd like to point out in this exceptional soundtrack is the track called Final Act. And this begins similar to Bumper on soft timpani and angry harpsichord, and then it enters with woodwinds and plucking strings and piano, and this all builds to the tragic final confrontation that we have all felt probably from the first frame and first note of Jerry Goldsmith music. We knew inevitably that this is where this story was going to have to go. And in this scene, Albert is tragically forced to shoot and kill Richard, and Richard tries to climb his way back into his safe space there in the basement, into the Crawlspace area up above himself, and he isn't quite able to pull himself there because of the gunshot wound that he has sustained, and he collapses to the floor, and then the camera pans up into the Crawlspace, and the end credits roll, and we're returned then to a very poignant version of the main theme. This thing is full of character depth, and you really do feel for every one of these characters, especially for Richard and Arthur and Alice. All in all, this is a bullseye of a Jerry Goldsmith re-recording. Congratulations to the great Lee Phillips, to everybody who was involved in bringing this project together on Kickstarter, all of us backers. This is such an amazing event. Get ready, check your mailboxes for your copy of Pursuit, The People Next Door, and Crawlspace. You are going to have the time of your life spinning this CD. Now, as promised, I'm going to turn you on to another incredible Jerry Goldsmith re-recording of music that was once thought lost, once thought never to be heard again, perhaps, by many Jerry Goldsmith fans. Click right here to watch the video covering in detail the Jerry Goldsmith at the General Electric Theater album from Entrada Records. Thank you very much for joining me again on My Favorite Soundtrack with Ted the Soundtrack Guy. We'll see you next time, and in the meantime, happy listening.